Hello, my sweet friends. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 3 of Seekers. The Quest Begins. Chapter 3 Toklo. Toklo crouched in the long grass. All around him, the trees waved softly, and he could feel the breeze ruffling his shaggy brown coat. Toklo opened his mouth and breathed in the musky smell of prey. He twitched his ears at the sound of snapping pine needles and let his breathing slow down until it matched the sighing of the wind. Then, with lightning quickness, he charged, sinking his claws into rabbit flesh. The creature squirmed and flailed, trying to get away, but Toklo's long, razor-sharp claws pierced its fur and pinned it to the ground. With a fierce snarl, the grizzly bear cub sank his teeth into the rabbit's neck. Toklo! Toklo, move! His mother's voice jerked Toklo's attention back to the real world. He let go of the log he'd been pretending was a rabbit and looked up. A fire beast was charging straight at him. Toklo scrambled backward as fast as he could, making it to the nearby grass just as the fire beast roared past, missing him by only a few paw lengths. Horrible black smoke filled the air as it shot by, spraying blown brown slush from the puddles over his fur. Blah! Toklo splat, rubbing his face with his paws. The taste of the fire beast's fumes was all over his tongue and up his nose. For a moment he couldn't smell anything except the beast and burning. Toklo, you troublesome cub! His mother lumbered over and cuffed him on the head, making his ears ring. How many times have I told you to stay away from the black path? You could have been killed. I could have scared away the fire beast, Toklo muttered. I've been working on my angry face. See? He raised himself on his back legs and bellowed, baring his sharp teeth. Nothing scares the fire beasts, Oka snarled, and you'll never be as big as they are, so don't even think about fighting them. Toklo wished he could be that big. Then nobody would ever scold him or tell him what to do, or him eat cat make him eat dandelions. He'd been following his mother through the valley all day, and they had barely found anything to eat. Although the season of fish leap was almost here, drifts of snow still covered the ground around the mountains, looking from a distance like piles of white fur on the rocks. But here and there it was melting, revealing patches of dirt and feeble bits of grass where snowdrops and dandelions poked through. Why can't you be quiet and obedient like your brother? Oka grumbled. She swung her head around to look at her younger son huddled beneath a tree. Obedient? Toklo scoffed. You mean weak. Toby's sick, Oka growled. He needs food. Gather some dandelions for him and eat some yourself instead of rolling into the black path like a blind deer. I don't like dandelions, Toklo complained. They're all smushed up and full of dirt, and they taste like metal and smoke. Yuck! He pawed at his nose, wishing he had a real rabbit. We can't afford to be picky, Oka said, digging through the snow with her giant claws. Food is scarce enough. You have to eat whatever we can find, or you will starve to death. Toklo snorted. Toby ate whatever he was given, and he was doing much worse than Toklo. So Toklo thought being fussy was just fine. He couldn't understand what was wrong with Toby. All he did was lie around looking sad and moaning. Toklo dug up a few dandelion stems and patted over to his brother. The damp grass under the tree tickled his paws as he nudged Toby's side. Come on, Toby, eat these, Toklo said, or else you'll be too tired to keep walking. Again, and Mother will probably blame me for not feeding you. Toby opened his dark brown eyes and gazed up at his brother. He pressed his front paw into the ground and lifted himself weakly up to a wobbly standing position. He leaned over and put his mouth around a dandelion, which he chewed as if it were a chunk of stone. Toklo sighed. Toby was useless, and he had been his whole life as far as Toklo could remember. He was too small and too tired to do anything fun. He couldn't hunt. He couldn't feed himself. He couldn't play wrestle. He couldn't even walk faster than a caterpillar. If it were just me and Mother, Toklo thought, forcing himself to eat one of the dandelions, we could run right across the mountains and chase rabbits and eat anything we wanted. His fur burned with resentment. Toby got all the attention and all the praise, but he was nothing but a burden. Toklo was the one who would grow up to be a real bear. He was the one who would take care of them all once he was big enough. Oka stumbled over, sniffing the air and warily eyeing the black path. Toklo could feel the rumble under their paws that meant that another fire beast was coming. Let's keep moving, she said. I think we've dug up all the dandelions here. Finally! Toklo woofed happily and broke into a run, galloping up the hill into the woods. There were much more interesting smells coming from up the mountains. In the valley, where they'd always lived, the smells of the flat faces and their fire beasts covered everything else. Toklo, his mother said sharply, come back here. We're going this way. The bear cub's shoulders slumped. But Mother, he whined, I want to go up into the mountains to catch a goat. I'm sure I could if you let me try. Toby will never make it up that slope, Oka pointed out, and it will be too cold in the mountains for him. We have to stay low until the snow melts, when it'll be easier for him to travel up there. Toby stood up on his back legs and pawed at his ears, trying to hide his frustration. It wasn't fair. Stupid Toby. Every decision they made was all about him. Let's check the sides of the black path, Oka said. If we're lucky, one of the fire beasts might have abandoned some prey. Fine, Toklo said, sprinting ahead along the edge of the black path. He liked the feeling of leading the others, of being the one who decided where to go, even if he wasn't really in charge. Oka followed, helping Toby plod along beside her and nudging him forward every few steps with her muzzle. Toklo stayed in the shadow of the trees, keeping at least a bear's length away from the black path. He'd never seen a fire beast leave the black path before, but he thought they probably could if they wanted to. The roaring and growling from the fire beasts started to hurt Toklo's ears, especially as more and more of them raced past. Toklo couldn't pick up any prey scents, and the sounds of the forest were completely drowned out. The rustling and puttering from under the snow, where mice and other tiny creatures lived, usually made his mouth water and his heart beat faster. Here, there was nothing to get him excited. After a long time, Oka barked to catch his attention. He turned and saw what she had spotted, a deer carcass lying by the side of the black path. He hadn't noticed it because it didn't smell like prey or like any kind of food. But he followed his mother and helped her drag the dead deer off the black path back into the trees. He sank his teeth into the flesh with a shudder, feeling the frozen meat crunch in his jaws, and dug his paws into the ground to pull it backward. As soon as they were under the tree cover, he dropped the carcass and wiped his tongue with his paws. That is disgusting, he announced. We're lucky to find any meat at all, his mother said. Here, Toby, take a bite. Dutifully, the smaller cub tugged free a piece of ragged flesh and swallowed it. Toklo tried to do the same. He bit into the deer's haunch, but it was hard to tear apart the frozen dead meat, and once he did get a mouthful, he couldn't bring himself to swallow it. He spit out the meat and sat up. I can't, he said, backing away from the carcass. It's the most horrible, awful, disgusting, dreadful thing I've ever tasted in my whole life. Toklo, Oka snapped. Stop being so fussy. By the great water spirits, are you a bear or a squirrel? I'm her, Toklo cried. Then eat like a bear, Oka said, or don't eat at all. See if I care. Toklo scratched crossly at the ground. This wasn't eating like a bear. This was eating like a scavenging wolverine. A real bear wouldn't eat the long dead carcasses killed by something else. He'd be out there chasing goats and rabbits and anything else with a heartbeat, slaying them with his long claws, powerful paws, and fierce teeth. A real bear would go anywhere he pleased, and he wouldn't have to drag a useless lump of fur like Toby along behind him. Well, Toklo was not going to eat this vile, stinking deer. Toby could have the whole thing. Not that he was strong enough to take more than 2 bites. Toklo sulked off to the nearest tree and sat behind it, rubbing his nose and making just enough grumbling noise so that his mother and brother could hear how upset he was. Oka had only brought Toklo and Toby out of their birth den 2 moons ago, and in that time they had wandered in circles up and down the valley, going from one feeding site to the next. At first it had seemed huge to Toklo, but now he felt bored and trapped, especially with the mountains surrounding them on all sides. They ate meat if they could find it, but mostly they had to make do with green plants, termites, and roots they could dig up with their long, straight claws. Their mother always kept them close to the black path of the fire beasts, which ran through the heart of their range. There was another path that crossed it higher up the valley, but that was a silver path, harder and shinier than the black path. And the fire beasts that ran along it were much longer and larger than the regular fire beasts. Toklo's mother called them snake beasts because they ran back and forth along the narrow silver path like big roaring snakes, making strange high pitched whistling and hooting noises that sounded like giant birds. Toklo could remember the place where the 2 paths crossed. They had found a grain spill there, piles and piles of grain just lying on the ground for them to eat. He hated the noise along the silver path, but at least the grain had filled him up. He perked his ears. A long, mournful sound wailed in the distance. He recognized it, and he knew that if they followed it, it would lead them to the track crossing place. Mother, he called, bounding to his paws and scrambling through the snow to her side. She looked at him wearily, pausing with her claws buried in the deer's neck. Do you remember the grain spill we found? Toklo prompted. I think we're close to where it was. I bet I could find it again. Toklo, Oka said, shaking her head. The grain will be long gone by now. I know, Toklo argued, but maybe there's been another spill. Maybe there's more to eat there. Shouldn't we at least look? He was so sick of being told he was wrong, of having to live his life limited by Toby's weakness. This was a good idea, and he was going to make his mother see that. To his surprise, Oka looked at him thoughtfully, the long brown fur rippling across her shoulders. Then she bent her muzzle to Toby, sniffed him once, and looked up at her older cub. All right, Toklo, she said, lead the way. Toklo's heart swelled with pride as they climbed over a low ridge and spotted the silver paths crossing in a dip below them. Found it! All on his own, he had tracked his way back to a food source, just like a grown-up grizzly bear. When they had still been under the snow in the birth den, Oka had told them stories about her life before she had cubs. She told them about one caribou that she had tracked through the deep earth sleep snow for 3 days until it was too exhausted to continue, and she killed it. That prey had provided her with food for many days. She also spoke of the places where rocks and snow charged down the mountains, roaring like bears. She would often dig for squirrels along these paths during fish leap season. Toklo's belly rumbled at the thought of fresh squirrel meat. He shook his head, trying not to think about it. Grain would be good enough for now. He wished they could hunt in the mountains, but he knew better than to ask his mother again. He'd only get the same answer he always did. Toby isn't strong enough yet. Mothers with cubs have to make do as best as they can. Only adult males are strong enough to eat whatever they want. Toby didn't wait to be full grown. He'd killed so much prey, he'd be able to feed his mother and brother too. He glanced back at Toby, shambling along with a weaving, dizzy walk. Oka touched her muzzle gently to her younger cub's head, encouraging him forward. Why did she waste so much attention on him? Toby would never be a great hunter. Not like Toklo. The smell of the grain reached Toklo's nose, and he picked up speed, running down the slope ahead of the others. When he reached a pile of the tiny yellow seeds, he bent his head and began to eat without waiting for his mother and Toby. His belly felt like an empty cave. He didn't care that the grain tasted dry and dustier than it had the last time they were here. At least it wasn't rotten deer meat that had been trampled by the fire beasts. Toby and Oka nosed around the pile, crunching through the scattered grain. Something rumbled under the ground, and Toklo leaned down to listen. The trembling shook his paws, and he stepped back, looking up to see one of the long snake beasts charging along the silver path. The sound of its rattling paws hurt his ears, and as it went by, it let out a long, mournful wail. Toklo buried his face in his paws, batting at his ears to clear out the ringing. As the noise was fading into the distance, he heard something else, the snapping of branches under large paws. With a fierce grunt, Toklo spun around. A huge male grizzly was walking toward them. It was twice Oka's size, with a jagged scar across its flank and a wild look in its eyes. It didn't speed up when it saw them, but it kept coming straight in their direction, as if it knew they couldn't fight him. Come on, Toklo, Oka called. It's time to go. She was already halfway up the next slope, shoving Toby along in front of her. But I was eating, he protested, clawing in the dirt. Toklo, now! He ran after her across the silver path, which stung his paws with cold sharpness. They galloped up a slope flecked with snow until they reached the edge of the woods. Sat down and looked back at the crossing place. The male bear was helping himself to the pile of grain, scooping it into his mouth with his paws. Toklo seethed with fury. It was not fair that they should be driven off so easily. It wasn't fair that he was so much smaller than that bear. He'd come all this way and found the grain on his own. He should get to eat it all. He wished Oka would stand up for them. Why didn't she challenge that bear down there and scare him off instead? Maybe if she fought a bit more and nagged a bit less, she wouldn't have to spend so much time worrying about finding their next meal. He glanced over at her and saw that she was pacing back and forth, growling to herself and shaking her head. Toklo padded over to the snowbank where Toby was huddled and sat down next to his brother. Oka looked pretty angry. Perhaps she really was thinking about going down there and fighting that bear. Toklo felt a prickle of excitement in his paws. He could help her fight. He'd be happy to use his claws for something more exciting than digging in the dirt. Suddenly, Oka rounded on them. You're both skin and bones, she spat. Toklo stared at her in astonishment. Wasn't his fault he was so thin. Skin and bones, she growled again. Living on grain and dandelions. You need fresh meat. Toklo nearly blurted out, That's what I'm saying. But he thought better of it. Given the look in his mother's eyes, he could almost imagine her feeding him to his brother. She probably would one day, he thought bitterly. That way precious Toby could live at least. Oka clawed at the snow, ripping up tufts of grass and flinging them in the air. An uneasy feeling crept through Toklo's fur. He didn't know why, but it frightened him to see her like this. What was she doing to the grass? She didn't expect him to eat it, did she? Finally, she stopped and looked at them again. With a heavy sigh, she sat down under a tree. we must go over the mountains," she said quietly. Toby and Toklo glanced at each other. This was strange enough that even Toby was paying attention now. "Over the mountains?" Toklo echoed. "Where she had always said they couldn't go because Toby wouldn't make it?" "There's a river over there," Oka explained. "A wide river filled with salmon. That is what we should be eating, not grain and leaves. You'll starve if we stay here any longer." Toklo shivered with excitement. He didn't know why his mother looked so worried. This sounded like the best idea she'd had in ages. A great adventure, a journey over the mountains, a chance to find out what a salmon looked like and tasted like. Oka had told him about the plump, juicy fish that leaped out of the water into your mouth, begging to be eaten. At last, his mother was making the right choice. And finally, he would catch salmon just like a real grizzly bear. That, my friends, is the end of chapter 3.